Have you ever made a logically perfect decision and felt, deep down, that it was wrong? Have you ever ignored that quiet voice, chosen the sensible path, and months later your body had already known the truth before your mind could accept it? Something inside you perceives what the eyes cannot see. And the question nobody asks out loud is, why did you stop listening to it? It wasn't weakness, it was conditioning. From an early age, you learned that obeying was safer than feeling, that having answers was worth more than having questions. Intuition didn't go away. It was buried. And between you and it, there are 5 layers of symbolic death. 5 things that need to be dissolved before that voice can be heard clearly again. This video is about that journey. Most adults didn't lose their intuition all at once. It was slowly taken away, as in a process so gradual it felt normal. Jung observed, over decades of clinical work, that young children live in a state of nearly continuous contact with their inner world. They feel before they think. They react before they calculate. Not because they are immature, but because they haven't yet learned to distrust themselves. Internal perception is still treated as valid information, not as an obstacle to be overcome by reason. The domestication begins when the approval of adults starts to matter more than what you sense inside yourself. It is an invisible process, well-intentioned most of the time. Nobody sits down with a 6-year-old and says, "From now on, ignore what you feel inside." The message arrives in other ways. When a child cries and is sent to their room until they calm down. When they say they don't want to hug someone and are forced to anyway, with a smile and a "don't be rude." When they express anger and learn that this expression carries a cost too high to repeat. Have you ever seen a child look at a smiling face and pull back, sensing something the adults around them simply don't perceive? That is intuition functioning in its purest state. The unconscious processing patterns, subtle inconsistencies, signals that don't match the surface. But then someone says, "Don't be silly, he's a nice uncle." And the child learns. They learn that what they feel inside is not trustworthy. That what others see on the outside is more real than what they sense from within. Jung called this process the sacrifice of the self in exchange for belonging. And most of us made that sacrifice so early that we don't even remember making it. The result is not stupidity or weakness. It is a highly efficient form of conditioning that teaches us to treat internal perception as noise to be filtered out. School reinforces this. What matters is the right answer, not the internal process that led to it. Work reinforces this. What counts is verifiable performance, not inner coherence. And the voice that knows, before analysis, before judgment, before fear, was gradually reduced to a murmur you can barely distinguish from the everyday noise of notifications, tasks, and demands. Before getting into the 5 deaths, there is a distinction that completely changes what you are about to understand. One that almost nobody makes when talking about intuition. And the popular version of the concept is almost a caricature of what Jung actually described. In common understanding, intuition has become synonymous with a mystical hunch, with energies that arrive without warning, with a supernatural voice that guides the chosen few. Jung was not talking about that. In Psychological Types, published in 1921, he described intuition as one of the 4 fundamental psychological functions of the human psyche, alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation. It is not a gift. It is not a privilege reserved for those who meditate surrounded by crystals. It is a psychic function as legitimate as reason. The difference is not in its validity. It is in its mechanism. Rational thinking is transparent. You can describe every step of the process. Intuition is opaque. It delivers the destination without showing the road. It operates through the unconscious, processing patterns and connections that the conscious mind has not even deliberately registered. Jung described it as the capacity to perceive possibilities that are invisible to reason, not because it is superior, but because it accesses a layer of information that reason simply cannot reach on its own. This has implications that completely change the way you understand your own inner workings. When you just know something without being able to explain why, you are not losing your mind. Your unconscious has processed data that your conscious mind hasn't organized yet. Micro-expressions, language inconsistencies, behavioral patterns already stored in layers of memory with no label attached. Yes, the problem is that we live in a culture that demands an explanation for absolutely everything. Why do you want that? What's the logic? Do you have proof? And when you cannot answer with a chain of verifiable arguments, you learn to distrust what you feel, even when what you feel is unmistakably right. And here is the detail that most analyses of intuition ignore completely, and that changes everything you are about to understand in the following deaths. The blockage is not just yours. It is structural. Jung warned, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, that the overvaluing of rational function was creating a collective psychic imbalance of proportions that civilization had not yet learned to recognize. We live in a civilization that built its entire identity around reason and treated everything that cannot be measured, explained, or optimized as superstition or inefficiency. Intuition fell into that same ditch, along with other forms of perception that didn't fit the model. Think about the logic of the world you inhabit every day. It rewards speed, and intuition needs silence to emerge. It rewards measurable productivity, and intuition has no delivery deadline or impact report. It rewards verifiable data, and intuition doesn't come with a supporting spreadsheet. In an environment like that, stopping to listen to your inner voice is not just difficult. It is perceived as a lack of rigor. People who follow their intuition are called impulsive. Those who ignore it and follow protocol are called professionals. The result is a collective pattern of disconnection that doesn't show up in traditional medical categories. It is something more diffuse, more everyday, and more persistent than any diagnosis can capture. It is the feeling that you are living a life that makes sense on paper but doesn't truly belong to you. That you are following a script that someone else wrote, and that you signed without reading carefully. Jung described this state as alienation from the self, when the ego organizes itself entirely around external demands and loses the thread that connects it to the deepest core of the psyche. And what makes this state particularly cruel is that it can coexist perfectly with external success. Promotions, stable relationships, visible achievements, all of it present while, underneath, there is a growing sense that something essential is missing, that you are drifting further and further from who you really are. This is not ingratitude. It is the cost of living in a system that was never designed to honor the inner world. This is not easy to recognize, because the external system keeps functioning and will continue to give positive feedback. Nobody is going to tell you you're losing yourself when you're being promoted, praised, chosen. The external feedback and the internal signal point in opposite directions, and you were trained to trust the external one. That is why the drift from the self is so slow and so invisible. That is why it can go on for decades before a crisis, a breakdown, an illness, an unexpected loss forces an encounter with what was being ignored. There is a mask you built so well that you forgot you put it on. Jung called this mask the persona. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, he described it as the interface the individual builds to navigate the social world. The name comes from Latin, the mask that Greek actors wore in theater to indicate the role they were playing. The persona is necessary. You need a way to present yourself to the world, to adapt your behavior to different contexts, to function within groups. The problem is not having it. The problem begins when you forget it is a mask. When the persona is confused with real identity, something silent and devastating happens. You begin to live in order to sustain the character. Every decision gets filtered through the wrong question. Not what do I really want, but what would this version of me, like the one others know, do? And intuition, which operates from a layer far deeper than any social role, simply has no space to speak in that context. It tries, and is immediately swept aside by the concern of keeping the performance consistent. I know this is hard to hear, because it means that some of the choices you called yours throughout your life were, in fact, responses to the role you were playing, not to the perception you had of yourself. You stayed in a relationship that had already ended emotionally because leaving would have been embarrassing to the narrative you had built. You stayed in a job that drained you because quitting seemed irresponsible for the version of yourself that everyone knew as stable. You smiled when you wanted to express sadness. You agreed in meetings where you wanted to push back. Each of those moments is not just a bad one-off choice. It is active training of the unconscious to stay silent. Every time you choose the role over your internal perception, you are telling the deepest core of yourself, your signal doesn't matter. What matters is the consistency of the mask. The persona was built for good reasons. It offers protection. It guarantees belonging. It reduces the tension of being seen as you truly are, with all the ambiguity and incompleteness that implies. Jung understood this perfectly. He was not saying the persona is a mistake. He was saying it becomes a problem when the ego can no longer distinguish what it presents to the world from what it actually is. And when that distinction disappears entirely, the individual stops being someone who wears a mask and becomes the mask. And they no longer have a persona. They have become it. There is a specific moment in many people's lives where this becomes visible for an instant and then is quickly suppressed. It is the moment when someone asks, "What do you really want?" And the person realizes, with a deeply unsettling discomfort, that they don't know how to answer. Not because they are indecisive, but because that question presupposes access to an inner world that has been obstructed for so long that the obstruction began to feel natural. The person looks inward and finds silence where there should be a voice. And then they interpret that silence as an absence of desires, when in reality it is an absence of contact. And here a cost appears that Jung described with precision. Every time you ignore an internal signal to avoid conflict or secure approval, you are not just making a one-time pragmatic concession. You are training your unconscious to go quiet. The intuitive voice tries. It whispers. It shows up as a physical discomfort you cannot name, as a hesitation with no logical explanation, as a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with hours of sleep. But if that voice is ignored often enough, it stops trying with the same intensity. Not because it disappeared, but because it learned it won't be heard regardless. Why spend energy on a channel that is never opened? Jung called the most advanced stage of this process a progressive withdrawal from the inner core, when the ego becomes so subservient to external expectations that the individual literally can no longer distinguish what they genuinely want from what they were conditioned to want. Of everything you call your goals, your values, your choices, how much is truly yours? How much was adopted because it seemed right for the version of you that others recognize and approve of? How much was built to sustain an image that originally protected something fragile inside you, and that is now too large to be abandoned without everything falling apart? You don't need to answer right now, but sit with the question. This is not an accusation. It is a diagnosis. Because the process of building the persona has no villain. It is a perfectly understandable adaptive response to an environment that rewarded performance over authenticity. You didn't do wrong by building the mask. You survived with it. The problem wasn't wearing it. The problem is when it starts wearing you. The death of the persona is not a tragedy. It is a liberation that feels like a tragedy in the moment it happens. Because what comes after it is uncertain, And uncertainty is exactly what the persona was built to avoid. But what comes after, when you begin to more clearly separate what you present to the world from what you truly are, is a space of silence where intuition begins, slowly and tentatively, to speak again. The second death is more subtle, and for many people, harder to accept, because resisting it feels completely rational. Jung observed that intuition fundamentally operates in the territory of ambiguity. It does not come with an instruction manual. It does not offer verifiable guarantees. It whispers with precision in a space where reason demands documented proof. And for highly rational people, people who have been richly rewarded throughout life for their analytical ability, that whisper seems too irresponsible to be taken seriously. The problem is not reason itself. It is the need for everything to pass through it before being considered valid. There is a philosophical idea that Jung returned to frequently in his work. Psychic maturity begins when you stop needing absolute certainty before you act. This is not irresponsibility. It is the recognition that genuine intuition lives in territory that reason does not control. And that as long as the ego needs to control everything before it moves, the most important signal the psyche can send will be systematically ignored. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true. Think about what happens when you are faced with a real dilemma. Not a technical problem with a logical solution. A life decision. About a relationship, a career, a direction. You feel an inclination. Something inside you points in a direction with a clarity that needs no arguments. But then the mind kicks in. What if I'm wrong? What if I regret it? What's the evidence? What will people think? And you enter a loop that never ends. Not because you genuinely need more information, but because the ego cannot bear the vulnerability of following something that cannot be proven. Jung would call this mechanism resistance from the complex, the wounded part of the psyche that prefers the familiar agony of doubt over the unknown possibility of transformation. Excessive analysis in this context is not a problem of too much intelligence. It is a sophisticated defense mechanism. The analytical mind enters a loop precisely when there is an intuitive truth the ego is not yet ready to accept. And the loop is the way it found to postpone indefinitely the moment of having to deal with it. You already knew the answer before you started analyzing. In most real dilemmas, the answer to that question is yes. And the analysis came afterward. Not to discover what was right, but to find arguments that would convince the ego it was permissible to follow what you already knew. You weren't thinking. You were stalling on what you already knew. The death of certainty is not the abolition of careful thought. It is learning to inhabit doubt without being paralyzed by it. Recognizing that genuine intuition lives exactly in that space of openness, and that it cannot speak clearly while the ego is busy trying to shield the outcome in advance. And there is a fundamental difference between productive doubt, the kind that investigates, that opens possibilities, and protective doubt, the kind that procrastinates, that piles up arguments until the moment of deciding never comes. Productive doubt arrives at a conclusion. Protective doubt never does, because it was not designed to. It was designed to keep the ego in a state of permanent analysis, where no real decision ever needs to be made, where the vulnerability of following an unverified perception never needs to be felt. It is a comfortable state in a very specific way. The comfort of someone who is too busy to have to be honest. This is not easy to recognize, because the mind that is stuck in an analysis loop doesn't look like it's avoiding anything. It looks like it's being responsible, careful, mature. It looks like it's doing the right thing. And in some cases it is. But in many cases, the cases that matter, the dilemmas where intuition has already sent a clear signal, it is simply postponing the inevitable with impressive efficiency. And now we arrive at a death that most people avoid with more creativity than any other. Before describing it, I need you to be willing to hear something that will trigger resistance in the ego. And that resistance, in itself, will already tell you a great deal about what is blocked. Jung defined the shadow, in ion and in the relations between the ego and the unconscious, as the repository of everything the individual rejects in themselves. Not just the impulses that conventional morality prohibits, also the talents that seemed dangerous to display, the desires that seemed shameful to have, the emotions that were declared unacceptable in the family, at school, in the social group. Everything that didn't fit in the persona, everything that was considered incompatible with the identity you decided to present to the world, was pushed into the shadow. Having a shadow is not a flaw. It is an inevitable consequence of the socialization process. No human being can integrate everything about themselves into a coherent social identity. There will always be material that gets left out. The problem is not its existence. The problem is when it remains completely unconscious, completely denied, completely separate from everyday self-awareness. Because an unintegrated shadow does not disappear. It acts. It sabotages relationships that threaten to expose it. It creates behavioral patterns you cannot rationally explain and that repeat themselves with a baffling consistency. And this is the central point for the theme of this video. It contaminates the intuitive signal in a way that transforms intuition from an instrument of perception into one of distortion. If you felt resistance in this section, pay attention to that resistance. It tends to show up exactly where the shadow is most active. Think of it this way. If you have a deep fear of abandonment that was never acknowledged, never named, never worked through, your intuition will systematically interpret neutral situations as signs of imminent rejection. The partner who came home quieter after a hard day will be intuitively read as someone pulling away. The message that took a while to be answered will be felt as growing disinterest. The shadow is not informing you about reality. It is projecting its unprocessed content onto reality and calling it intuition. The same applies to any unintegrated content. Repressed anger toward authority figures will distort your reading of anyone who holds that position. Seeing control where there may simply be a management style different from your own. Unresolved shame around ambition will produce gut feelings of failure whenever you are close to a real opportunity. The shadow is a filter you don't know you have, and it distorts everything that passes through it. And this explains something many people experience but few can name precisely. The intuition that lies. You followed a strong gut feeling, a signal that seemed unmistakable, with all the quality of a genuine perception. And it turned out to be completely wrong. And then you concluded that your intuition is not reliable. But Jung would say the problem wasn't the intuition. It was the shadow interfering with the channel. Genuine intuition and fear disguised as intuition are difficult to tell apart precisely because the second uses exactly the same language as the first. Physical sensation of certainty, emotional urgency, the quality of "I just know." The difference lies in the source. One emerged from a clear perception of reality. The other emerged from unprocessed trauma being projected onto it. If you're enjoying this content, I'd check out in the first comment our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. It goes deeper into exactly this work of shadow integration that Jung described as the most direct path to genuine self-knowledge. The only way to cleanse this channel is to do the work that most people avoid with every ounce of energy available to them. Look directly at what you reject in yourself. Not to punish yourself, not to build a narrative of self-pity, but to stop being governed, silently and without permission, by what you refuse to see. Jung was explicit on this point. You do not eliminate the shadow by denying it. You empower it. Every piece of content you refuse to acknowledge as your own gains more power over your decisions, your reactions, and your perception of the world around you. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting on your most destructive impulses. It means recognizing them as yours, naming them, understanding where they came from, and with that recognition, stripping them of the power to act unconsciously on your behalf. An anger you recognize is an anger you can choose what to do with. An anger you deny keeps acting in your name, without your awareness and without your control, distorting every perception that passes through your filter. And this work has a byproduct that many people don't expect. As you begin to recognize the contents of the shadow, the gut feelings that were actually projections begin to distinguish themselves more clearly from genuine perceptions. The channel becomes cleaner not because the shadow disappears, but because you learn to identify the specific flavor of the distortions it produces. And with that, genuine intuition, which was always there, operating beneath the noise, begins to be perceived with progressively greater clarity. And now we arrive at a paradox that the ego will try to resolve before it even finishes listening. But if you resolve it too early, you will miss what matters most. Jung made a distinction that most people never encounter anywhere. The ego is not the same thing as the self. The ego is the center of consciousness. It is the I you call yourself when you think, plan, remember, make decisions. It is necessary. It is the structure that organizes conscious experience. The self is something fundamentally different. It is the center of the entire psyche, us including the unconscious layers that are vastly more extensive than consciousness. It is from the self that dreams, creative impulses, and the deepest intuitive perceptions emerge. And it is toward the self that the process of individuation, the path of becoming whole, is oriented. A healthy ego establishes a relationship of dialogue with the self. An inflated ego, one that believes itself to be the totality of the being, that needs to control all information before acting, that positions itself as the undisputed arbiter of all internal decisions, creates such constant noise that the signal from the self becomes inaudible. This is not arrogance. It is loneliness disguised as control. Intuition emerges from the self, and it cannot be heard when the ego is in permanent monologue with itself. Jung called the state identification with the ego, a kind of psychic possession in which the individual confuses their persona, their conditioned behavioral patterns, and their complexes with their total identity. And the inflated ego has one very specific characteristic. It cannot genuinely listen, not out of malice, but because listening implies admitting that something beyond itself knows more, and that the inflated ego simply cannot tolerate without feeling it is being destroyed. I understand that part of you may want to disagree with what I'm about to say. The inflated ego has an argument for everything, but hear it through to the end. It is the person who never asks for help, because asking for help would mean admitting limitation, and their identity was built around inexhaustible competence. Who interprets any criticism, on even the most well-intentioned, as a personal attack that must be refuted? Who analyzes situations with impressive sophistication and still makes the wrong decisions repeatedly? Because all analysis is unconsciously in service of confirming what the ego already decided, not of genuinely investigating what is happening. The ego is not afraid of being wrong. It is afraid of being unnecessary. Jung described this state with a precision that remains unsettling. The person identified with the ego lives in a kind of deep psychic isolation, not because no one is around, but because nothing from outside and nothing from inside can truly penetrate the armor. They hear without listening, agree without integrating, reflect without changing. And what they call intuition is almost always just the ego confirming what it already decided, yet wrapped in a sensation of certainty that feels internal but is only circularity. This is not easy to recognize in yourself. The inflated ego has access to every argument that justifies its position, and has the specific ability to use the very concept of self-knowledge to protect itself from real self-knowledge. A person can spend years studying Jung, reading about the shadow, discussing individuation in conversation circles, and use all of it as yet another way to sustain the identity of someone who knows themselves, without ever allowing the actual content to sink in. Intuition demands a posture that the dominant ego is psychically incapable of assuming. Genuine openness, the willingness to receive something you did not build, did not control, cannot claim as the product of your own effort. A signal that arrives without asking permission, that doesn't follow the logic you established, that sometimes directly contradicts what your conscious mind had concluded. The inflated ego rejects this kind of information not because it is wrong, but because the way it arrives is unacceptable to a system that needs to be the origin of everything. The partial death of the ego is not handing control of your life over to external forces. It is the real capacity to say internally, there is something inside me that perceives more than my conscious mind can organize, and to let that recognition effectively change what you do next. You weren't in control. You were in the way. The last death is the one the ego most easily outsources to the future. And that is exactly why it is so hard to actually go through with. Most people live divided between two places that don't exist. A past that cannot be changed and a future that hasn't arrived yet. Intuition operates in the only real place, the present. Not the present as a technique or spiritual concept. The present as the only space where information exists before being filtered by the narrative the ego constructs around it. Jung was one of the first Western thinkers to take seriously the idea of synchronicity, the perception of meaningful connections between events that do not follow the logic of linear cause and effect. He observed that the unconscious frequently picks up on patterns in the present moment that the rational mind, obsessed with temporal sequences, simply does not process. Intuition, in this context, is not a prediction of the future. It is an expanded perception of the now, of the patterns that exist in this moment, of the connections that the linear mind cannot see because it is too busy organizing everything into a timeline. And there is something about the relationship between time and intuition that goes beyond the conceptual. It is almost physical. When you are in a state of constant anticipation, body tense, mind half an hour ahead of the present moment, already calculating how to respond to what hasn't happened yet, there is a quality of perceptual closure that is palpable, as if the senses were aimed at a direction that is not the now. Intuition cannot reach that state. It only exists in the present, and in a body that is present within it. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true. A mind in a state of permanent alertness is scanning the horizon for threats that haven't arrived yet. It is always one step ahead of the present, anticipating, calculating, preparing for a disaster that may or may not happen. A mind obsessed with regret is reprocessing scenes that can no longer be changed, replaying conversations, revisiting decisions, looking for the moment where everything could have been different. In both states, the present, which is the only place where intuitive information exists and operates, is completely out of reach. Chronic structural tension, in that sense, is a constant war against intuition. Jung observed that much of the accumulated psychic exhaustion of modern life comes not from specific, isolated traumas, but from the ego's continuous resistance to what the unconscious is trying to communicate. The ego resists the experience of the present, because in the present, it has no control. It can only encounter what is there, without the protection of narratives about the past or plans for the future. And every time the mind enters a loop of anticipation or rumination, it is technically moving away from the only channel through which intuition can transmit clearly. This has a physical dimension that is rarely discussed. The state of permanent alertness is not just a mental pattern. It takes up residence in the body in very specific ways. The jaw slightly clenched that you only notice when you finally relax. The shoulders that drift back up on their own minutes after you consciously lowered them. The breath you discover was held when you finally let it go. These are the physical signs of a system that was never taught to inhabit the present without monitoring the horizon. And while the body is in that state, intuition, which uses the body as a channel of communication just as much as it uses the mind, simply cannot be read with any precision. Have you ever been in that state without realizing you were? In the shower, when the mind stopped for a few minutes. On a walk with no destination and no earbuds. In a moment of such complete exhaustion that the mind stopped fighting the present and simply gave in. And suddenly you knew, not because you thought, but because you stopped thinking long enough to listen. You knew what you needed to do in that relationship. You understood what was wrong with the project. You recognized what you really wanted before any analysis. That was not a coincidence. That was intuition working in the only environment where it can work. The real present, without the constant mediation of the ego and its temporal preoccupations. After all of this, after the 5 deaths, a question emerges with the force of something that had been waiting to be asked. What remains? What is born after dissolving the persona, abandoning certainty, integrating the shadow, diminishing the ego, and learning to inhabit the present? Jung had a word for this process, the most important in all of his work: individuation. Individuation is not a state of arrival, not enlightenment, not a diploma you receive after completing 5 steps. Jung was explicit. The goal of individuation is wholeness, becoming whole, not becoming a saint. It means integrating the denied parts, honoring internal contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately, stopping the sacrifice of fundamental pieces of yourself in order to fit into definitions that others created for you. And when this process begins to happen, even partially, even stumbling, even if you step back and move forward and step back again, intuition no longer has to fight to be heard. The channel is gradually becoming cleaner. The interference is gradually becoming more recognizable. And the voice that emerges is not new. It is ancient, strangely familiar, like the sound of something you recognize but didn't know you had lost. Jung described this recognition with a formulation that remains unsettling. The self was always there. It never left. What the ego spent an entire lifetime building was a series of elaborate structures to avoid hearing it. Masks, certainties, denied parts, inflated pride, and flights from the present. And when those structures begin to come apart, not all at once, but piece by piece, death by death, over a process that lasts as long as life itself, what appears is not strange. It is the most familiar thing that exists. This does not mean life gets easy. Unlocked intuition does not solve problems. It does not eliminate pain. What changes is the quality of the relationship you have with yourself while navigating all of it. Instead of acting out of fear of disappointing someone whose approval you tied to your self-worth, you act from a perception that is genuinely yours. Instead of seeking external validation to confirm you are on the right path, you have a contact, imperfect, fragmented, but real, with something internal that guides you, not something that tells you what to do at every step, but something that allows you to know, at least, in which direction you are walking. And that difference between living without an internal compass and having a thread, however faint, of connection to who you are, is greater than any external achievement you have ever chased. But there is still a practical question that needs to be answered. How do you distinguish genuine intuition from its imitators? How do you know, in the real moment, whether what you are feeling is a clear perception or the shadow projecting? Fear disguised as wisdom, desire dressed up as certainty? Jung described the signals of the self as frequently arriving through nonverbal channels, on dreams with persistent images that return in variations over weeks. Specific physical sensations, not pain, but something subtler, like a contraction or an opening that you recognize but that has no anatomical name. clarity that appears without effort, often in moments of least control, in the middle of the night, in the shower, in the exhaustion at the end of the day. In those moments, the ego has lowered its guard enough for something deeper to manage to send a signal. But there is also a more everyday language the self uses, one that is rarely recognized as such. The tiredness that shows up every time you enter a certain context, a certain conversation. Not physical tiredness, but that specific heaviness that begins before you even arrive. And the enthusiasm that surfaces around things that don't make sense for the narrative you have built about yourself. The resistance you feel when executing something you rationally should want, something you interpret as laziness or lack of discipline, when in reality, it is information about alignment that you haven't yet learned to read. And there is a specific quality that distinguishes genuine intuition from its imposters, something most people recognize immediately when it is described, because they have lived it without the vocabulary to name it. Genuine intuition is quiet. It does not shout. It does not simulate urgency. That feeling of, I need to decide right now before it's too late. That is fear. It does not arrive accompanied by elaborate justifications and a need to convince yourself. That is the ego selling an idea it already decided on in advance. Genuine intuition arrives as a quiet certainty that persists even after the noise dies down. You can ignore it. You can analyze it until it seems irrational. You can pile up arguments against it. But when the silence returns, when the mind stops fighting itself and the ego stops defending itself, it is still there. Patient, undramatic, simply knowing. Fear, by contrast, creates pressure. It uses the language of intuition. I feel that. I'm certain that. But it leaves behind a trail of tension, a need for external validation, a temporary relief that doesn't last. The shadow projecting onto reality has a very specific thematic quality. It always has the same flavor, because it is expressing the same unprocessed content. Its themes are consistent and recognizable once you learn to look at them honestly. The rejection that shows up everywhere, the control you perceive in anyone who holds power, the betrayal you anticipate even when there is no real sign of it. Learning to tell the difference is not an intellectual exercise you do once and master. It is a process of ongoing self-knowledge that becomes progressively more precise as you get to know your shadow better, as you grow more honest about your fears. It is not perfect, but it is incomparably more accurate than the alternative of simply dismissing everything that cannot be verified. There is one last thing Jung said about individuation that needs to be named, because it goes directly against most of the promises the modern world makes about self-knowledge. Unlocked intuition is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of a different relationship with who you truly are. You will not arrive at a point of perfect perception where every inner signal is unambiguous and every choice is aligned with some higher truth. Life remains ambiguous, paradoxical, often painful in ways that intuition does not resolve. What changes is the quality of the relationship you have with yourself while navigating all of it. The sense that you are making decisions that are genuinely yours, not merely conditioned responses to external stimuli. Jung said that the most courageous question a human being can ask themselves is not, who should I be? That question will always be answered by the persona, by conditioning, by the expectation of the group. The courageous question is, who am I already beneath everything I learned to pretend? And intuition, when finally unlocked from the 5 deaths that held it prisoner, does not give a definitive answer to that question. It gives something better, the capacity to keep asking without collapsing from the tension, to live with the question open, to inhabit your own life as a space of genuine discovery, knowing that the path is being walked, not despite the uncertainty, but through it. And if this idea resonates with you, if at some point in this video you felt that what was described has something to do with what you experience inside, then you are already closer than you think. Not because closeness guarantees arrival, But because the simple act of recognizing, of naming what had been silenced, is already an act of listening. And intuition, which has a patience the ego will never understand, knows exactly what to do with that gesture. If you stopped suppressing what you already know inside yourself, if you let die the persona that is no longer you, the certainty that paralyzes, the denied part that distorts, the ego that does not listen, the time that slips away, who would you become? Not the version others expect, not the version you built to survive the environment you were given, the whole version, and the one that existed before the mask, before the need for approval, before you learned that feeling was dangerous. That question has no intellectual answer, but your intuition already knows, and it is waiting with a patience that transcends any timeline the ego can imagine, for the moment you finally decide that listening is worth more than controlling.